An ancient person would build an idol, okay, stone, wood, whatever it is. And they're not idiots. They know that they just built that thing. The idea wasn't that this is my deity and then it just dies there. The idea is that I will build this object as a home for a spiritual entity. They would do ceremonies on the idol, like the opening of the mouth. Because opening of the mouth, that means it's alive because it takes in breath and all that kind of stuff, just like someone who's breathing is alive. Well, they would transfer that thinking to this object. They would perform some ritual with the idea that when we open the mouth, the entity, the spirit entity, will come and inhabit the object or attach itself to the object. That's why in ancient texts, when idols were destroyed, people aren't thinking, oh, my God's dead now. No, they're thinking, man, when I get home, I got to build another one. And then apologize for letting that happen to the first house, and then do the ritual again, and then the deity will come back and reside with me, or in this temple, or whatever it is. So there's a connection, there's a direct connection between idols and Elohim, gods, in the ancient world. They're not, separable things in that one is real and the other isn't. The whole reason you created an idol was to get this real entity to attach itself to it and be with you so that you can barter with it. This is the essence of polytheism. You placate the gods. You believe that you need them on your side to live a good life. It's really typical when we talk about the supernatural worldview of the Bible that the bad guys get all the press. I mean, everybody's interested in demons, because of Hollywood and whatnot. They just seem to get more attention than they're probably due. It's about time that the good guys get some focus, that they get some stage time. So what we want to do here is give them their due and focus on the good guys and not the bad ones.
Here's what's happening on page 1 then. The God of the Bible wants to share his universe with other creatures. That's the depiction. Mm-hmm. And he wants to share it in such a way that his rule and authority over it is mediated by these delegated creatures.
And that's the key idea.
Celestial
and terrestrial.
It's the idea that when this conflict is going on Earth, there is also conflict in heaven, but there's also spiritual input into the outcome of whatever this conflict is. And the best way that you convey that is to use military language. I mean, this is what it is. It mirrors what's going on Earth. We have this heaven and earth, symbiosis going on again. The Bible asks us to believe a lot of strange things about the spiritual world. At first, we might be tempted to ignore them, but if we say we believe the Bible, we can't avoid these concepts. Much of what we think we know about the spirit world isn't true. It's been filtered down through centuries of church tradition. Angels do not have wings. Demons don't have horns or tails. And for the biblical writers, the unseen realm was home to more than angels and demons. There were other, bigger players. So do you believe what's in your Bible? Scholars of the Second Temple period have noticed, because it's kind of hard to miss, that there seems to be an uptick in interest when it comes to angels, again, members of the heavenly host, both the good guys and the bad guys in the Second Temple period. For instance, in the Old Testament, you only get angels that get names 2 times, like a proper name. In the Second Temple literature, that just sort of blows up. I mean, there are lots of named angels, named entities. And so scholars look at that and think, well, there must be a reason for that. They seem to be more interested in this. Why is this sort of thing happening? And honestly, to be blunt about it, basically they're just guesses. Everybody's just sort of guessing as to why this is. Some will say, well, there's a greater interest in angels because the Jewish community of the intertestamental period just viewed God or felt that God was more distant or remote. And they speculate that what we mean by that is that God was sort of disconnecting himself a little bit, because the community is still sort of in exile anyway, because 10 of the tribes are still missing. And it's like saying that God is sort of trying to decide whether he's still interested in working his plan again. But that's actually the kind of thing that people will say, because they're saying, look, God is, to these people, less interested and less active, and he's sort of using the lesser members of his heavenly host to do things that he might have done in the Old Testament. And that shows that these people are thinking that God doesn't quite really want to buddy up with us anymore, and so he's assigning these tasks to lesser beings, intermediary. He doesn't want to mess with the riffraff so much. That theological speculation sort of has won the day in academia. Now, it is sort of fair that if you have this intertestamental period, there is still a sense of being in exile. We even get that in the New Testament. That much is fair. There is a sense that God isn't sort of directly visiting people anymore. Like, you don't see the angel of the Lord. You don't have these things. I don't think we can draw any firm conclusions about why things get written the way they get written in this area. Yes, it could reflect kind of a woe is me, or I wonder if God still likes us, or if God is still upset with this kind of thing, that people aren't sort of personalizing the relationship between God and Israel so much anymore. That's all going to change dramatically, of course, with the New Testament. And so, since I do view the New Testament as something different than this other literature, I think the very least we can say is that God was still interested. He's still, working a plan. The plan is still in effect, but that doesn't mean that God has to keep prompting people to write about it. Okay? So again, I tend to be one that doesn't care to speculate too much on that, but you do see an uptick in angel activity in the period.
The chapter begins to paint us an image of the era in which the Watchers make their move. We are told that it was a time where man had multiplied greatly, and humanity appeared to be on an upward trajectory, with more and more lives being born. In this time, we are told that the daughters of the men were comely and beautiful, not just in their looks, but in their innocence, their spirit, and their righteousness. It appeared to be a time where if there was sin, it had not been proliferated or exacted in the capacity that would come to follow. But sin would soon make its mark on the earth, when the Watchers, a group of angels in heaven, noticed the beautiful women, and were enraptured by them. The most interesting takeaway from this chapter shows us that temptation is not just something humans have to deal with, but that also the angels themselves can be swayed by sin. The Watchers, as their name suggests, were deemed by God to do exactly that, to watch over the humans and never intervene. So it is by this that we see them painted as something of antagonists in these chapters, for the very first action we see them commit is a violation of God's rules. You'll notice that the chapter seeks to highlight the severity of temptation, in that the angels, in this case, are referred to as the children of heaven, and that even these creatures, divine as they were, gave into their impulses. They lay out their objective clearly, in that they intend to take the women for themselves, have sex with them, and father offspring. This interestingly gives us a new idea that is not established in the Bible, in that angels, at least the Watchers in this case, are not only able to conceive their own plans, but are also able to produce offspring with human women. It would also appear that their desire wasn't just stirred by the beauty of the women, but by their desire to father children, suggesting that, like us, the divine creatures also foster an innate urge to procreate, or at least share the values of the mortal men of the time. Here we learn that there were a total of 200 angels who descended from the heavens to lay with the mortal women, and that their landing was upon the summit of Mount Hermon. We also learn that this all took place in the times of Jared, the father of Enoch, and a 6th generation descendant of Adam and Eve. Unfortunately, I cannot be certain about the pronunciation of the names of each of the angels, and depending on the translation or version of the Book of Enoch, the names can be spelled differently or appear entirely different altogether. However, the relevance of each angel's name does not appear to affect the Book of Enoch in any conceivable way, and it would appear that the naming of the angels was merely the original author's method of giving some character or significance to these particular watchers.
Another example would be 1 Kings 22, where God allows members of the heavenly host to participate with him in making a decision. Sometimes God will send one, Daniel 4, to an individual. And when we get into Daniel 4, you have an instance where a watcher, a holy one, brings a message to Nebuchadnezzar. And he actually tells Nebuchadnezzar, what's going to happen to you is by decree of the watchers, plural. But he also says it's by decree of the Most High. It's important to realize that the court or the council or the assembly do not operate autonomously. They operate in tandem with the highest authority, and that would be God himself. Another term that's really interesting is Aramaic, gir or girin, and that's the term that gets translated watcher, or the plural, watchers. This one's interesting because, on the one hand, scholars, like to debate where this term actually comes from, sort of what its root meaning is, and there are those who think it comes from a verb that means to be watchful or to be awake. I mean, you have a difference there, and you say, well, what's the difference? Who cares? Well, if you opt for the meaning, the root meaning and derivation of to be wakeful, like to never sleep, then that could conceivably be sort of a bucket one term. It tells you what a thing is. It is a being that never sleeps. But if you opt for the watching, actually the task or the duty, the service rendered, then it's a bucket three term, which is where I put it in the book. I think that the case is better for that one. So what you have is you have a being whose service rendered to God is to watch. Whatever's going on, on earth and wherever he's tasked to be, watching whatever that thing is, or whoever those people are, to keep an eye on, essentially. And this is a term that's pretty rare in the Bible. It's used only in Daniel 4, which is the Aramaic portion, part of the Aramaic portion of Daniel. And there it is combined with a bucket one term, a watcher, that is, a holy one. Okay, so you actually get this combination, one term that for sure tells you what a thing is, and then we've got another term that sort of denotes a task, what this Holy One does. But curiously enough, in this instance, the watcher, the one who's keeping watch, the Holy One, brings a message, but he's never actually called a malach in the passage. He's never actually called an angel, but nevertheless he does the task. And I think the interesting point here is the way he sort of presents what's going on. This message is a little bit different than a lot of your, I don't want to call them generic messages from angels, because that's not, that's a pretty special event. But in the chapter, the watcher makes clear that this decision, Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to go crazy for a while, so just get ready. This decision is by decree of the watchers. And then 3 verses later, it's by decree of the Most High. So apparently, this is a group that, again, has a bit higher status than your ordinary angel. And so since we're dealing with Nebuchadnezzar and empire and all this sort of stuff, a member of the court, essentially, the elite, decision-making class, is actually tasked with, you're going to go and tell him, what's going on here. Now, that's in turn important because in the Second Temple literature, watcher becomes a term that is more frequently used, and I think not coincidentally, it is used as a term to translate sons of God, which is that middle tier, kind of language, that elite part of the bureaucracy.
Yeah, what the biblical authors are clear is that idols, statues, that they are not Elohim. Mm-hmm. They're pieces of wood.
Right.
However, what they are not claiming in these texts about idols, Psalm 115 is a classic example. What they're not saying is those idols aren't connected to,
Yes.
or in some way,
An intermediary for...
an Elohim, a real spiritual being. This is why Paul the Apostle said to the Corinthians, yeah, don't go eat in these temples dedicated to Zeus or Apollo. So they believe in the reality of spiritual beings. Moses can say in Deuteronomy 10 that Yahweh, the God who rescued Israel out of Egypt, he's the Elohim of Elohim.
Got it.
Which is like the Holy of Holies, the most holy space. He's the most God of God. So there's like about 3 or 4 passages that talk about no Elohim beside Yahweh, or don't have any other Elohim before me.
Yeah.
Is one of the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
What that's not saying is other Elohim don't exist. What it's saying is there's no Elohim that fits into the category of Yahweh, the chief Elohim. No. What they do have in common is that they are both spiritual beings.
Yes.
Which there's a populated spiritual universe in the biblical story, just as there's a populated human universe. And actually there's an important relationship.
In Mesopotamian thought, though, there's a story that is the backstory to all this. It's a story of a group of divine beings called the Apkallu. Now, right away you have to think like a Mesopotamian and think like an Israelite. Israelites are your biblical crowd, followers of Yahweh, at least ostensibly. And the Mesopotamians are followers of any number of gods. Marduk is the big one, when this gets written. He's the lead deity. So you've got Israel, Mesopotamia, good and evil, all that stuff going on. Well, the Mesopotamian story of the flood includes the idea of supernatural beings coming to earth and cohabitation. But in their version, it's a good thing. This is why Babylon is known for its immorality, certainly its idolatry, for its dark arts. Okay, they were an empire. But those are good things because we're Babylon and we're great. There's no one like us. We are the top dog of civilization. And what the Babylonians wanted people to know is the reason we're so wonderful and so awesome and so unbeatable is because the gods helped us create Babylon. They give the gods credit. And in the Apkallu story, the Apkallu are thought of as culture heroes by the Mesopotamians, the great civilizers of their civilization, the ones who taught the Babylonians all sorts of things to build their power. So they're heroes, they're good guys. These 7 sages, there are 7 of them, were created by other gods in the abyss. That ought to ring a bell. Okay? They're created in the abyss. One of their jobs was to ensure the correct functioning of heaven and earth. They had great power, great knowledge, and they're going to teach humans things, ostensibly to create civilization. But again, the Jews look at this and they go, this is horrible. We shouldn't have random bloodshed. We shouldn't have immorality. We shouldn't be worshiping other gods. We shouldn't be doing any of this garbage. But if you're a Babylonian, you're like, yeah, sign me up for that. The wisdom taught by the Apkallu to the Babylonians corresponds precisely to the forbidden knowledge that you'll see listed in Enoch. That's not a coincidence. Again, negative view, positive view. The Apkallu, they also, archaeologists have discovered little figurines, because the Apkallu, again, they're viewed as good guys. They're not viewed as sinister demonic figures by the Babylonians. They would make figures of the Apkallu and bury them in foundations of buildings to protect the building, from whatever the Babylonians didn't like. And their name for those sculptures was Matzere in Akkadian. It means watchers. That's not a coincidence. Again, that's Enoch's term for the sons of God who fell before the flood. It's not a coincidence. He's getting it from Babylonian material. The higher gods in the Babylonian story one day, because the Apkallu are kind of mid-level deities. They have important jobs, but they're not the ones who make the decisions. They're not the ones who call the shots. They just do stuff.
They're real smart and do stuff. So the higher gods decide, we're kind of sick of humans. You read Enuma Elish or the Gilgamesh epic or something like that, you're going to get this story. We're kind of sick of humans. They make a lot of noise. They just, this was just a bad idea. So, you know what? We're going to get rid of them. We're going to send a flood and wipe them out. And then the gods, high-five each other and, great idea, what? Let's just get rid of them. Well, the Apkallu hear this, and they're like, you got to be kidding. I mean, we've invested a lot of time in these people. We've taught them all sorts of things. How in the world, all that work is going to be lost if we just, if they just get destroyed. So they decide, well, okay, we can think of a way to sort of transmit our knowledge to human survivors of the flood, and then we can sort of start up again. Our work will not be lost. Now, the Era epic, which is a Mesopotamian text, is a key source for this.
Now, if you think about watchers, let's just think about the little bit that we've sketched out here. If they are, again, a higher status than others in the heavenly bureaucracy, if they indeed are part of a class that makes decisions, then the reasoning would go that this class might know things that other members of the heavenly host don't. In other words, there's a question of knowledge here. That, again, becomes sort of significant because in Akkadian, which if you're a Semitic philologist, this is my training, the precursor to Aramaic in Babylon was Akkadian. And the Akkadian term there for those who watch is matzare, which, again, curiously enough, is a term that is used as a label for figurines of guess who? The Apkallu. And the Apkallu are the Mesopotamian equivalent of the sons of God in Genesis 6 that committed the transgression with women before the flood, the whole thing. So there's actually a very discernible sort of linguistic connection between all of these things, all of these terms. And I find it interesting, at least, again, we don't want to spend too much time on the evil guys, but when we think about, hey, how in the world does the New Testament and the intertestamental literature, how do they sort of pick up on the idea that before the flood, one of the sins of the sons of God wasn't just the woman thing, but it was transmitting knowledge to humans that they should not have? Well, the answer to that is this terminological link. Again, this inner circle, having greater knowledge. And then you're not supposed to dispense that to people unless you're told to go and do that particular thing. So that is actually part of the transgression. The example of the Apkallu, takes us into the bigger question of, the relationship of biblical material to other ancient material. Now, if you go out on the wild world of the internet, you're going to see things and hear things like, oh, the stuff in the Bible, the biblical writers didn't have any original thoughts, they just stole stuff from ancient literature. That is pretty ridiculous. I mean, what's going on is a lot more normal, a lot more human. God picks humans to write scripture. Again, what could be more obvious? Humans live in places. They live at certain times in certain regions. And guess what? They're not in monasteries. They're not hermits. They interact with other people. They are literate. They read books. They engage in conversations. The places where they live have trade with other parts of their world regionally. And so that's one reason why you have, one culture writing their version of whatever it is that happened, or how they answer the questions about the spiritual world, and then another culture doing the same thing. People are interacting and they're reading this stuff. There's a regional proximity that is the reason for similarity. If you grow up in a region, then you're going to have shared worldview to some extent. You're going to have shared culture to some extent. In other words, this should be the least surprising thing in the world when it comes to looking at the Bible. This is what it means to read the Bible in its own context, really its own contexts, because the biblical writers were part of a world. They lived somewhere and they had this interaction. There's no coherence or even proof that a biblical writer is like, man, I want to finish this book, I want to write this paragraph, but I can't think, so what's the next thing I can steal? There is no sort of chain of goes from tablet to text to this other text, before it gets to the New Testament writer. They're not passing things on. They're not using Federal Express. I got to mail this to John so he can finish the book of Revelation because, again, he can't think any independent thoughts. I mean, this is the kind of absurdity that you see in sort of, or you get from the village atheist, who really isn't thinking at all about what it means to be a person living in the ancient world and reading material, and then again, in our view, by the providence of God being prepared intellectually and just in terms of life experiences to produce a piece of writing that God will preserve for the believing community. This is just how it works in the real world and real life. It's the most normal thing that you can imagine.
Chapter 7 continues with the unfolding of the Watcher's plan, as we see them take the mortal women as wives. The text tells us, "And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms, and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants." There is no indication that the women consent to the advances of the angels, or whether they are taken by force. But it would perhaps not be so difficult for the angels to deceive the women into sleeping with them. In any case, we are told that the Watchers defiled themselves with the women, suggesting they engaged in multiple sexual debaucheries and moral turpitudes. But interestingly, it would seem that the Watchers did not return to heaven after, but instead stuck around for a bit, perhaps intrigued by the mortals or otherwise infatuated with their beauty. They began to teach them charms and enchantments, the cutting of roots, and gave them knowledge of plants. Here it can be interpreted that the Watchers taught the mortals the use of magic, that which was forbidden knowledge and not the sort of thing that God had ever intended for man to wield. The charms and enchantments are unfortunately not specified in the text, but they appear to contribute to the earlier remark of the Watchers being defilers, perhaps defiling mankind's innocence with the practice of what might have become witchcraft or sorcery. We are then told more of the sin that would come to have greater repercussions on the earth, and that was the conceivement of the children between the Watchers and the mortal women. Here we are told that the women gave birth not to regular babies, but instead bulbous beasts that were as tall as 3,000 ells, and not without a temper. These giants, thought to be the Nephilim, were monstrous and had insatiable appetites, so much so that we are told here that they consumed all the acquisitions of men, most likely their cattle. When the food ran out, the Nephilim turned violent and began to consume mankind themselves. So disastrous were the Nephilim that no one was able to keep them in check, as they ran amok on the earth, more savage than anything that had preceded them. Chapter 7 concludes by telling us that mankind were not the only victims of the Nephilim's rage, as we are told, and they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh, and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. The consequences of the Watchers' actions are dire to say the least, and this is before God has even intervened.
Genesis 6, okay, again, we're all familiar with this passage, sons of God, daughters of men. Nephilim on the earth in those days and also afterward. People who were reading these texts, who were not sort of conditioned to not let them say what they plainly say, took a supernatural view of this. They weren't troubled, by some of the questions that pop into our heads. Well, how does this work? And they're not there. They reflexively do this. And two of the people that do that are Peter and Jude. So now you got a problem. which is why you'll read all sorts of exegetical gymnastics that will say things like Peter and Jude, they weren't thinking about Genesis 6. And Peter and Jude are obviously familiar with that stuff, and they're not flustered by it at all. They embrace it, they bring it into their text. It just is what it is. So you can say that Peter and Jude were wrong. I mean, you can do that, but that's basically what you have to do to eviscerate or, cut the supernatural out of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. This is a quote from Anas, the Mesopotamian Apkallus. Now, Apkallu was a Mesopotamian. Before the flood, they were completely divine. After the flood, they're not. Okay? After the flood, they're for lack of a better term, they're a mixture. They're a hybrid between divine and human, and they also happen to be giants. Okay? If it gives you a little idea where we're headed here. Okay, Apkallu were the wise men. They are cast as the culture heroes of Mesopotamia, the great divine minds that brought civilization to humans, dispensed it from their divine realm to humans, and this is the Mesopotamian explanation for why they're just so great. Why Mesopotamia is just so great, especially Babylon. Okay, this is why we're ahead of the game, because the gods gave us all this knowledge. That's who the Apkallus were. Now, the Apkallus are the ones who are going to get demonized as the sons of God, and their sons, the Nephilim. And those figures in later Enochic literature appear as the Watchers and the Giants, illegitimate teachers of humankind. So Anas is saying, this is the focus point, these Apkallu guys. Greenfield in DDD, Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible, if you're going to buy one reference book about this kind of stuff, this is the one, DDD. Says this, in Mesopotamian religion, the term Apkallu, Sumerian Abgal, is used for the legendary creatures endowed with extraordinary wisdom, 7 in number. They are the culture heroes from before the flood. Now, we're not told directly that Marduk is angry because of the cohabitation, but what we are told is that after the flood, they are of human descent, the Apkallu are, and Marduk is ticked. Marduk gets angry with the Apkallu and consigns them to the netherworld, never to return. Does that sound familiar? Okay. So we get that much in the Mesopotamian material. They violate the divine order, again, the way Marduk wanted things to happen in the Babylonian version. Somehow, some sort of cohabitation is part of that. Before they were divine, and then we've got a mixture after the flood. Marduk's mad, sends them to the underworld. And again, back to the 2/3 thing. Let's skip ahead here. The 2/3 thing used of Gilgamesh is important because Gilgamesh is not only called master of the Apkallu, but he's also described as a giant. Now, that's the real quick and dirty version of every point in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 has a counterpoint in the Mesopotamian Apkallu story. The Enochian material, the material written after the biblical stuff but before the New Testament, okay, intertestamental, Second Temple Jewish literature, for some reason, and there are academic explanations for this that make sense, but again, the quick version is, for some reason, whoever's writing the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees and some of these other books, the Book of the Giants from Qumran, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, whoever's writing this stuff knew the Apkallu story really well. And they write their version of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 with the Apkallu story in mind. So this is why Enoch has the offending watchers being sent to the realm of the dead and bound, because that's what happens to the Apkallu. We don't read that in Genesis 6. We only got 4 verses there. You get hints of it a little bit later with some of the Rephaim who live in the netherworld and passages like Ezekiel 32. You get little bits and pieces of it. But whoever's writing the Enochian stuff is really well aware of this. And they preserve the original context for Genesis 6, 1 through 4. That's what they actually end up doing. we can know about it because we can go back today and read cuneiform stuff. That's what Anos did. That's what his whole article is about. Let's go back through, look at all the cuneiform stuff. Can we find, have an eye toward Genesis 6:1-4? Can we find that stuff in the Mesopotamian flood stories? Let's take another look at it. And so he did in 2010, and the results are just awesome. I mean, he did a great job. So we can look at that and we can kind of know, what they're sort of fishing for, because if we know the Mesopotamian Apkallu story, we can read Genesis 6:1-4 and say, okay, sons of God, daughters of men, Nephilim, before and after the flood. Okay, we know what they're shooting at. But it's the Enoch stuff that adds their punishment. And that's the stuff that Peter and Jude pick up on and winds up in Peter and Jude.
Chapter 8 of the Book of Enoch tells us more about what the Watchers taught mankind whilst they were on Earth, and how they went about with their corruption. We are told of Azazel, a Watcher who taught men to make swords, knives and shields, breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth, and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all colouring tinctures. Despite not being the leader of the Watchers, much of the condemnation in the fallout is reserved for Azazel, who we later learn is pursued by the Archangel Raphael with the utmost prejudice. Perhaps because unlike Samjaza and the others who taught the mortals magic, Azazel taught them how to make weapons, and worse yet, how to use them. With this idea, it is believed that Azazel showed man how to hurt each other, how to wage conflict on each other, and how to kill each other, and instilled in man a sense for warfare. The magic given to mankind by the other Watchers was perhaps harmless, inconsequential even, but the crafting of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates that were taught by Azazel brought only pain and suffering. You'll also notice that Azazel is responsible for man's mastery over the metals of the earth and the art of crafting them into bracelets and ornaments, objects that would be fought over or even idolized by mankind. It is these sorts of items in jewellery, ornaments, and costly stones that would inspire greed and envy, destructive sins that would corrupt man. The beautifying of the eyelids is another interesting aspect mentioned in the passage, and some have thought that this was in relation to makeup and cosmetics, and that Azazel taught the less beautiful women how to compete with those who were naturally blessed in the looks department. Some have also said that this painting of the face was a deception, and that Azazel instructed the women to do this in an effort to entice men and make the world promiscuous. In any case, the Watchers' efforts to corrupt man were successful, as chapter 8 tells us, and there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways.
It's fair to say there's an uptick in literary output in the Second Temple period that concerns angels. Enoch is the big example. Now, Enoch is an apocalyptic text. One of the reasons why for that book and books like it that are in that same genre that we get more angel activity is actually because of the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament prophecies of the day of the Lord include descriptions of angels, the angel armies coming with the Lord at the day of the Lord, at the end of days, and all this sort of stuff. And so in a text like First Enoch that is very apocalyptic in nature, Enoch sort of tries to explain the course of human history and what's going to happen at the end of days. The righteous are going to go here, the wicked are going to be punished. And so there's this depiction of this kind of time period. And so it would be very natural to give the reader a heavy dose of angel stuff because of the way this period, this prophetic period, this eschatological period is described in the Old Testament. So that kind of explains for that genre what's going on. Now, for books in the Second Temple period that aren't in that genre, you still have angels show up. They assist people here and there. It's not with the sort of frequency, again, that you might see in the biblical books, but it's still there. It doesn't entirely go away. It's still part of the picture. I think if we had the author or authors of Enoch, because it is something of a composite book, kind of like the Bible is. The Bible is actually a collection of different books. That they would say, look, our goal here is to have the wicked warned. What's interesting for our purposes here is that they link the reason why judgment is going to happen to earlier rebellions in the Old Testament. That's why the Watcher story is a big deal. It sort of frames the discussion for the mess that humanity's in and how God is going to just bring this whole thing to a close. So there is continuity of thought in that sense. But so the writers want people warned. They want people to repent. If you don't repent, here's your destiny. Here's the destiny of the righteous. Here's the destiny of everybody else. They also want to describe it in terms of the finality of the judgment of these supernatural beings as well. In other words, that's a way to say there's coming a time when all of this evil, not just human failure and evil, but cosmic evil and chaos, is going to be done. It's going to be over with. So this is essentially why it gets classified as an apocalyptic text. It very much has the end of days in mind when the whole thing is consummated. One of the other trajectories, though, that's kind of interesting, like with the Dead Sea Scrolls in a number of texts, is that there's a very strong theology put forth that scholars refer to as the angelic priesthood. And you have a number of texts. The Shabbat Shirot, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, are probably the most prominent example, where the order of heaven not only should get mirrored on earth, but must be to preserve the fabric of the cosmos. There was the Qumran sect, whoever that was. The dominant opinion is that these are the Essenes. They believed it was their responsibility to maintain the cosmic order of the heavens on earth. And they would do this through ritual, not only in priestly stuff, but also in the observance of sacred calendar. And this really gets kind of esoteric, but really interesting. This group actually left the Jerusalem priesthood, what we would think of as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, okay, that whole bunch. They actually separated from them because they didn't like the calendar that the other side was using. The people at Qumran believed that everyone should be using a mathematical calendar, not an astronomical calendar, because the astronomical calendar was imperfect. Again, now we know that a year is 365 and a quarter days. Okay, so the typical Jewish community would have been using a lunar calendar. 12 times 30 is 360, so 360 days in a year. They would add 5 to make it 365, but they wouldn't add the quarter. So periodically they'd have to add an extra month. And the Jewish calendar still today does this. This is why the date of Passover varies. It depends on when the extra month gets added and all this lunar cycle stuff. And the Essenes looked at that and they're saying, that's ridiculous. You have to contrive this calendar. What you should be doing is you should be looking at the first day of creation, the first day that time and timekeeping became a possibility was day 4 of Genesis. So that is day 1 in their calendar. They said if you just do everything on a specifically mathematically defined calendar of 360 days, and then you add a day between each quadrant of 90, then every Sabbath occurs on the same day of every year. Every sacred feast occurs on the same day in every year. The events of the Old Testament never occur on Sabbaths, so people don't work. They had a mathematically precise, beautiful, perfect calendar, and they believed that reflected the mind of God because God is perfect. And so since you're not doing that calendar, we're out of here. And they went out in the desert, and they, without a temple, went through all the temple stuff. They did all the ceremonies, they're doing all the festivals and all the rituals because they believed that this is what's happening in heaven. This is how the seasons pass. This is how the days and the nights function. And so we on earth need to be in total sync with heaven. And so for that reason, you get a lot of angel literature, because there were people in the Jewish community, this one particular sect, that believed the entire cosmos essentially hangs on us being in sync with them. I actually do think the angelic liturgy stuff is important because we do have New Testament theology about us becoming council members. We do have as in heaven, so on earth thinking. I mean, maybe not to this degree, but we do have this symbiotic sort of thing going on, that we are the earthly representation of the heavenly host, the heavenly bureaucracy. It's just the Essenes really just sort of took it to the nth degree and went out in the desert and pretended to have a temple. Part of the Book of Enoch that, again, people find either really odd or really interesting is something known as the animal apocalypse. Now, this is an allegory where the characters of the Genesis 6 episode and the Deuteronomy 32 worldview thing, again, that rebellion, really the history of Israel, both in primeval days and moving forward, is retold with certain animals taking the place of certain characters. It's another retelling, just in a different form, of this whole story about why the world is the mess that it is. You can tell that they're tracking on the rebellion themes because they're doing an allegory on the Genesis 6 episode, which they take very seriously. And the whole situation about the nations of the earth being sheep with false shepherds, and the false shepherds need to be replaced by the great shepherd. It has this New Testament feel to it. And so scholars have sort of taken note of this and seen that, you know what, they're doing theology on the basis of a set of conditions in the Old Testament, and that's what the New Testament is doing too. And sometimes the language is really close to how they're envisioning this, how they're talking about it.
Looking for somebody who's going to be the linchpin figure for the day of the Lord. And that's a nice way of saying they're looking for somebody to take revenge on their oppressors. And we usually cast that as a military, deliverer. So yeah, there's a strong current of that, but it's not really aimed exclusively at Rome, okay, or some historical oppressor. While you're being oppressed, God wants to know if you're still faithful. There's your Torah element. So the wicked, it casts a wider net than that. But interestingly enough, for our times, a lot of the characterization of the wicked is what we would call social injustice. Basically, that translates into just treating people like garbage. Treating those who are weaker or lesser social status than you with contempt. And if we were talking about unseen realm, the way I would say that is, we're all imagers of God, and we're supposed to treat each other like we're fellow imagers, because lo and behold, that's what we are. Okay, our status is equal. And it's fascinating to me that in Psalm 82, the gods of the nations are condemned for explicitly the same things that the wicked are condemned in 1 Enoch. Again, just injustice, abusing people, sowing chaos, poverty, just all this stuff. And Scripture and Enoch actually links that behavior to cosmic darkness. So you'll even get a little flavor of that, in the Book of Enoch, that behind all of these abuses and the terrible condition of the world in these terms, behind that there's a supernatural intelligence that's just putting the foot to the pedal and flooring it. They had a sense of that in the ancient world that we've sort of lost in the modern world. And so, again, it's useful to remember, hey, the worldview of the biblical writers was this stuff. It wasn't, post-Enlightenment, modern technological society stuff. There was a spiritual backdrop to this that it's nice to sort of get reminded of. Even in something like an Enoch commentary, it's there.
So demons are spiritual forces at work behind corrupt human power structures.
Yes, but in the Bible, they also work on the personal level, animating and exploiting humanity's greed and selfishness, as well as the weakness of our mortal bodies. In the Bible, spiritual evil is at work in anything that drags God's good creation back into chaos, darkness, and death.
So this is why when Jesus arrives on the scene, He said his primary enemy is not human.
Right. Jesus and his first followers viewed all the pain and suffering in God's good world as a sign of its captivity to death and spiritual evil.
But they didn't think this was the end of the story.
Right. Jesus knew that the only way out of this cosmic ruin is to overcome evil and death itself, even if it costs him everything.
We need your help. Ring Them Bells is a non-profit organization where every dollar donated goes right back into the mission of spreading the good news and helping those in need. The main ministry of Ring Them Bells is serving those in need in the name of our King Jesus. Over the past year, we have fed over 2,000 meals, and next year, we want to double that. We can't do this without your support. Everything we create here and all of the food that we serve is free because it's paid for by generous viewers just like you. If you feel led to donate and join the mission with us here at Ring Them Bells, click the Give Butter link in the notes and comments of this video. If you can't support us financially, please continue to like and share the content, as this helps us so much with spreading the good news about what Jesus has done for our world.